In ancient Greece, slavery meant constant suffering and brutality. In Athens, slaves worked in perilous mines, facing deadly tunnels and toxic fumes. In Sparta, they were oppressed and cruelly controlled. Despite these harsh conditions, many endured unimaginable hardships. This was the grim reality of slavery in ancient Greece, where survival itself was a relentless struggle. The reality of Greek slavery. In ancient Greece, the notion of freedom was far from universal. While some reveled in the vibrancy of city life, others were trapped in the harsh reality of slavery. Slaves played a crucial role in society, working in households, fields, docks, and workshops. Their fates were shaped by forces beyond their control. But how did they find themselves in such dire situations? There were numerous ways one could become enslaved in ancient Greece. Some were born into slavery, with no hope of ever escaping their status. Others met their fate through abandonment. Infants left by parents who could not afford to raise them were often taken in by those who would raise them as slaves. Financial hardship also played a key role. Families in distress sometimes sold their children, particularly daughters, who were seen as less valuable for farm work. The constant threat of kidnapping was another grim reality. Pirates and bandits frequently captured people, selling them into slavery. For those unable to purchase slaves, stealing them was a common alternative. War was perhaps the most significant source of slaves. Prisoners of war were either ransomed or sold into slavery. Interestingly, even Greek citizens could become slaves due to debt, forced to work off what they owed, sometimes for life. Despite the golden age of Greece, many endured lives far from golden. Slavery was an integral, if painful, part of society. Life as an Athenian slave. Athens, renowned as the cradle of philosophy, art, and democracy, had a hidden truth beneath its intellectual and cultural achievements. While the city boasted grand architecture and bustling markets, it was also built on the back of slavery. During the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, historians estimate that Athens had around 80,000 slaves, an astounding number, nearly equal to the city's entire population at the time. The average Athenian household owned 3 or 4 slaves, though poorer families might not own any. In Athens, slaves were legally regarded as property, much like livestock or furniture. Masters had the freedom to buy and sell them as they pleased, and slaves could be punished at the whim of their owners. A slave's life was completely dependent on their master's needs and temperament, with conditions varying greatly based on the individual's role within the household. Household slaves, who performed various domestic tasks, often enjoyed better conditions than others, though this still didn't equate to real freedom. They participated in family rituals and celebrations, even partaking in sacrifices. However, they were still considered outsiders, never truly part of the family. Their names were chosen by their masters, and they were prohibited from entering certain public places reserved exclusively for free citizens like the gymnasium, public assembly, or palestri wrestling schools. Another group of slaves in Athens was the public slaves, owned by the city-state rather than individual masters. These slaves had a unique status in the social hierarchy. While they were still enslaved, some were able to eventually buy their freedom. Once freed, they could become metics, resident aliens who were excluded from full citizenship but could live and work in Athens. A rare few might even be granted citizenship, though this was an exceptional outcome. For most slaves, the dream of freedom and citizenship remained unreachable. The roles of male and female slaves in Athens were determined by gender and their specific duties within the household. Male slaves often ran errands, shopped for their masters, and worked in agriculture, tending to crops and animals. Some worked in more hazardous conditions in mines and quarries. Male slaves with independent roles might have been required to make periodic payments to their masters. Female slaves, on the other hand, were primarily responsible for domestic work. They managed household chores, wove wool, and sometimes worked in the shops around the Agora, Athens' public square. Some served as wet nurses, caring for the infants of their masters' families, while others helped raise the children. These women often formed emotional bonds with the children they cared for, though those bonds were not recognized by society. However, the lives of female slaves were frequently darker and more harrowing. As property, they were at the mercy of their masters' temperaments, meaning that their lives could range from relatively fair treatment to frequent abuse. Sexual exploitation was rampant, with female slaves having little ability to resist unwanted advances from male household members. Some were forced into brothels as prostitutes, while others lived as concubines. Concubines provided physical companionship for their masters, but had none of the rights of a wife. These women were sometimes housed alongside the master's wife, though at other times, they lived in separate quarters. Their children, born from these relationships, might grow up in the master's household, but without any official status or recognition. Despite the complexities of family life, the answer to whether a slave could find comfort in it is clear, only in rare cases. The harsh realities of slavery in Athens left little room for true familial connections, with slaves often treated as mere property. The dehumanization of Athenian slaves. Life for a slave in ancient Athens was harsh and closely controlled, with even their personal relationships fragile and easily broken. Slaves might have families, spouses, and children, but these connections held no value in the eyes of the state. A master could separate family members at any time, scattering loved ones without a second thought. Athenian law offered little protection for slaves. They had no legal rights and relied entirely on their masters to represent them in court. While a free person committing a minor crime might only face a fine, a slave could be subjected to physical punishment, with lashes given for each drachma of the fine. For slaves, punishment was always physical, not financial. Worse still, if a slave was needed to testify in court, their testimony was not simply asked for, it was extracted by force. Slaves were presumed to protect their masters, so to get a truthful statement, they were often tortured. They could be tied to a rack and whipped until they either confessed or said whatever was needed to stop the pain. Sometimes the torture would push slaves to the brink, even costing them their lives. The goal wasn't justice, it was obtaining answers at any cost. Despite this brutality, there were some strange regulations designed to limit cruelty. If a slave was severely mistreated, the master could be sued for damages, and any citizen could prosecute them for excessive violence. These rules weren't intended to protect the slaves, but to maintain some control over societal violence. In rare cases, a slave could buy their freedom. Although they couldn't own property, some masters allowed slaves to run small businesses, provided they paid a fee. With persistence, some slaves saved enough money to eventually purchase their freedom. Socially, slaves faced strict limitations. For example, slave men were forbidden from pursuing romantic relationships with free boys, which was acceptable among free citizens. If caught, they would be publicly whipped. These barriers kept slaves separate from free people, even in personal matters. Life in Athens was unforgiving for slaves, with constant reminders of what they couldn't do, where they couldn't go, and the rights they would never have. For some, even darker and deadlier paths awaited, the mines of despair. In ancient Greece, the mines were both a source of immense wealth and a place of unspeakable suffering. Riches from silver, lead, and other minerals flowed into the city, but the price of extracting them was steep. Deep within the earth, slaves worked in total darkness, without fresh air, and faced constant danger. Athenian citizens, aware of the risks involved, avoided these deadly jobs by employing slaves, who were abundant in the region. It's estimated that between 10,000 and 30,000 slaves labored in the mining district of southern Attica during the 5th and 4th centuries BC. These slaves weren't simply assigned to the mines, they were leased out by their owners to mine operators, much like rented tools. Wealthy men, including the influential politician and general Nicias, profited greatly from this system. Nicias owned around 1,000 slaves working in the mines, which brought him an annual income of 10 talents, a return of about 33%. The mines kept his wealth flowing, but at the cost of countless lives. The lives of mining slaves were brutal. Most worked deep underground, shackled to prevent escape. Without sunlight or fresh air, they toiled in damp, cold conditions. The poor ventilation made the air thick with dust and the stench of wet rock, making breathing itself a challenge. The constant fear of tunnel collapses added another layer of terror. One tremor could bring the ceiling crashing down. Beyond these hazards, slaves endured harsh treatment from overseers, who were often slaves themselves but considered more valuable. These overseers were tasked with ensuring high production, driving the miners to work without rest. Many slaves collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies pushed beyond their limits. Some never made it out of the mines alive, and even those who did were left with little to show for their suffering. The dangers extended beyond the mines. In 413 BC, after the disastrous Athenian campaign in Sicily, 7,000 Athenian prisoners were forced into hard labor in the quarries. Not a single one survived. The mines and quarries were places of certain death for those unfortunate enough to be sent there. It's difficult to imagine the horrors these slaves endured daily. Each day began in darkness, with no guarantee of seeing another sunset. The hardships they faced were extreme, yet in other parts of Greece, slaves endured different but equally harsh struggles. The Helots. Critias, an ancient philosopher, once said that the free in Sparta were freer than anywhere else, while the slaves were more fully slaves. His words weren't mere poetry, they captured the harsh truth of Spartan life. In Sparta, slaves were known as Helots. Unlike slaves in other city-states, Helots didn't belong to private masters. They were owned by the state itself. The Spartans viewed them less as workers and more as subjugated enemies. Helots were forced to wear degrading clothing to mark them as different, a constant reminder of their inferior status. Today, the term Helit is still used in Greece to describe someone enduring grueling labor with little reward. What's shocking is the vast number of Helots compared to Spartans. For every Spartan, there were approximately 20 Helots. These slaves were vital to the Spartan economy and daily life. The food that nourished the Spartans and the functioning of their city-state were all reliant on the labor of the Helots. Spartan families were given land, known as a kleros, by the state. However, unlike in Athens, where families worked their own land, the Spartans left this task to the Helots. The men of Sparta focused on military training, hunting, sports, and politics, considering farm work beneath them. It was the Helots who worked the land, planting, cultivating, and harvesting the crops. Their labor not only fed Spartan families, but also contributed to the communal meals that were central to Spartan society. These meals were where Spartan citizens came together to bond and uphold their culture, while the invisible Helots made it all possible. In exchange for their work, Helots were allowed to keep a small portion of what they grew, but the majority went to the Spartans. While the Spartans reaped the rewards without lifting a finger, the Helots lived lives of inequality, working endlessly with little to show for it. This system allowed Sparta to remain focused on war, keeping its military strength at the forefront. Yet, beneath this military dominance, the Helots endured a life of hardship and oppression, their place in Spartan society firmly reinforced by cruelty and control. Tools, not people. The Spartans didn't just dominate the Helots, they broke them. To the Spartans, Helots were not people. They were mere tools for labor. The Spartans made it clear that the Helots were tied to the land they worked and to the masters who controlled them. Public beatings were common, not as punishment for rebellion, but as a constant reminder of their place. These violent acts were almost ceremonial, used to reinforce the power imbalance and remind the Helots of who was truly in control. To further humiliate them, the Spartans forced the Helots to drink heavily, aiming to teach their youth what could happen if they overindulged. The young Spartans mocked and belittled the Helots in this state, taking advantage of their suffering as a lesson in subjugation. This cruel spectacle was yet another method to keep the Helots broken and submissive. As if this wasn't enough, the Spartans had an even more terrifying practice. It was not considered a crime to kill a Helit. They were completely defenseless, with no legal protection from violence. In fact, young Spartan men were encouraged to kill Helits. Armed with daggers, these men would roam the countryside, randomly murdering Helits. This served as a tool to instill fear and ensure that the Helits never forgot their place in Spartan society. The system was harsh but cunning. Spartans were vastly outnumbered by the Helits, who performed all the labor that sustained their society. However, the Spartans lived with constant fear that the Helits, with their numbers, might one day rise against them. To keep this fear in check, they devised the Cryptia. Each year, young Spartans who had completed their training were sent out to declare war on the Helits. Their mission was simple: kill as many Helits as possible, particularly the strong and healthy ones. By targeting the best of the Helits, they ensured no leader or hero would emerge among them. Though revolts by the Helits occasionally occurred, they were always crushed. No matter how hard they fought or who they sided with, the Helits never achieved true freedom. The Spartan system of control was brutal, built on fear and terror. Every act of violence, humiliation, and oppression was meant to keep the Helits weak, ensuring they remained subjugated for the benefit of Spartan society. The Helits' strange role in Spartan warfare. In Spartan society, Helits were not merely laborers, they served a much more complex and unsettling role. By day, they worked the fields, providing the food that kept the state running, but their responsibilities didn't end there. When war arrived, the Helits were drafted, but not as soldiers alongside their Spartan masters. Instead, they filled menial support roles, carrying armor, fetching supplies, and sometimes even being sent into battle as poorly armed fighters, tasked with covering gaps in the Spartan ranks. For the Helits, military service was akin to a death sentence. A single misstep could cost them their lives. However, strangely, some Helits saw it as a rare opportunity. Occasionally, a Helit who showed exceptional bravery or skill in battle might earn their freedom. Though such instances were incredibly rare, it gave the oppressed some hope, a glimmer of possibility amidst the harsh reality they faced. The Spartans, however, had a calculated purpose in sending the Helits to war. It wasn't out of kindness. They were fully aware of the potential danger of the Helits' large numbers. If given too much freedom or power, the Helits could easily revolt. Yet keeping them entirely controlled would lead to resentment and low morale, which could turn them from reluctant participants into active rebels. To maintain control, the Spartans used a system of rewards and punishments. They occasionally offered spoils of war or promised freedom for exceptional service, but these rewards were rare and always came with heavy strings attached. Punishments for failure were severe, and the ever-present threat of the Cryptia, the secret police, kept the Helits in line. Caught in this oppressive balance, the Helits were both needed and feared but never truly trusted. They worked tirelessly under the sun, haunted by the knowledge that freedom was always out of reach. Any reward they received was a calculated measure, meant to keep them obedient without ever granting them true power. But the Spartans had even darker plans for the Helits, ones that would ensure their control over them in ways that went far beyond labor. Bloodlines of Bondage. The Helits in Sparta were slaves, but their situation was distinct from other slaves in ancient Greece. Unlike the slaves in Athens, who had no families or communities of their own, Helits were encouraged to form families and communities. This was part of Sparta's strategy to maintain control over the Helit population. By promoting family life, the Spartans ensured the population remained steady. However, there was a dark side to this. Just as the Spartans trained their warriors to be strong, they applied the same principles to the Helits. Only the strong were allowed to survive and pass on their lineage, while the weak were often discarded or even killed. This brutal method was all about maintaining control rather than ensuring survival for the sake of prosperity. Additionally, Spartan men sometimes fathered children with Helit women. These children, known as Nothi, occupied a liminal space between freedom and servitude. They weren't full citizens, but weren't full slaves either. Boys might join the army or work in public service, but girls, unlike their male counterparts, were often discarded, with no role in Spartan society. In both Athens and Sparta, slavery was driven by power and control, leaving little regard for the humanity of those enslaved. It serves as a stark reminder of the lengths societies will go to maintain power, regardless of the cost to human dignity. Slavery in ancient Greece was a brutal and dehumanizing institution that trapped countless individuals in a cycle of suffering. If you found this historical exploration insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the past. Share this video to help others learn about the harsh realities of ancient societies.